Hello everybody, my name is Ken Bowser. In this lecture, I'll discuss the fundamental differences between tropical and sidereal reckoning. First, you need the basic definitions. Tropical astrology reckons positions of bodies from the northern hemisphere vernal equinox. The equinoxes and the solstices mark the middle and the extremes of the sun's declination cycle that define the seasons. The central issue is that the seasons are disconnected from the stars as a frame of reference. Sidereal astrology reckons positions of bodies from the stars. In this system, the zodiac is defined by the stars themselves and is disconnected from the seasons as a frame of reference. There are two main types of sidereal astrology, Eastern and Western. Eastern sidereal astrology, known as Indian or Vedic astrology, came out of the Indus River Valley civilization in India. Western sidereal astrology developed in the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley civilization in what is modern Iraq, in particular in the city-states of Sumer, Uruk, Babylon, and Nineveh, which are near modern Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra. The ancient Babylonians were the most conscientious stargazers and record keepers in the Near and Middle East. It's their records that have allowed ancient astrology to be unraveled. Both Eastern and Western branches employ the sidereal zodiac, but Indian and Babylonian methodologies are quite different. The layout of modern Western sidereal is similar to tropical, with the sidereal zodiac positions employed instead of the tropical. This gyroscope illustrates precession, which is the mechanism that separates tropical from sidereal reckoning. Due to the gravitational pull on the Earth's equatorial bulge, primarily exerted by the Sun and the Moon, the Earth's spin axis precesses, but excruciatingly slowly. The period of one complete precessional cycle is 25,800 years, which means each 30-degree segment of the zodiac is traversed in 2,150 years. The Earth, as a giant gyroscope, shows that the orientation of the equinox with respect to the stars changes as the Earth's spin axis precesses. This is why the stars in Pisces rise with the northern hemisphere vernal equinox in this era, and have done so for the past 1,800 years with respect to the 12-fold equal division sidereal zodiac. There are two fundamental planes in astrology which were not understood at the same time. These are the celestial equator, which is the Earth's terrestrial equator extended off the planet into space, where it is renamed the celestial equator, and the ecliptic, which is the plane in which the classical planets orbit the Sun. The original frame of reference was the equatorial system, used by everybody, even loosely by the Babylonians. The Babylonians, as a result of long, careful observations, noted that the path of the planets was not the celestial equator, but the ecliptic, where eclipses take place, from the Greek verb eklippo, which means to omit or leave out. That is, the orbital planes of the planets are within a few degrees alternately above and below the plane of the ecliptic. The ecliptic is not the plane of the Sun's equator, extended out into space. The ecliptic deviates from the Sun's equator by 7¼ degrees. The Babylonians also noted the Moon's orbit, which is inclined 5 degrees to the ecliptic. The discovery of the ecliptic was not an instantaneous event, but it's unique to the Babylonians. Their discovery was made possible due to their extensive observational records. Identifying and mapping out the stars on and close to the ecliptic was something new and fundamentally difficult more than 3,000 years ago. It required an altogether new frame of reference that was nevertheless tied to astronomical verity. The work was completed during the first half of the first millennium BCE. The ecliptic and the celestial equator are not interchangeable, which is shown by this slide. The angle between them is called the obliquity of the ecliptic, which is currently slightly less than 23½ degrees. The Babylonian development of ecliptic emphasis has been recognized by historians of science as one of the greatest technical achievements of antiquity. Before the Babylonians identified the ecliptic, the celestial equator, which is the Earth's terrestrial equator extended out into space, it bears repeating, was the standard throughout the world, including China. In ancient Egypt, the entire sky, including circumpolar constellations, were employed, although the emphasis there was on stars near the celestial equator. This video is an example of an equatorial orientation. You can see the stars rotating around the celestial pole, which is most obvious at the highest terrestrial latitudes. What you can't see in this slide is the plane of the ecliptic at an oblique angle to the celestial equator, which is apparent in the previous diagram. The ecliptic is the midline of the zodiac, which extends approximately 9 degrees above and below the ecliptic, to include the maximum distance of the classical planets from the ecliptic itself. When Venus is retrograde, she can have as much as 9 degrees of celestial latitude above or below the ecliptic, which accounts for that zodiac boundary in terms of latitude. Zodiac, from the Greek zodiakos, means of or belonging to animals. Also, zodion, a little animal, a small figure painted or carved, and when plural, especially the signs of the zodiac. These definitions are from Liddell and Scott's Greek-English lexicon. I didn't make them up. The zodiac is the direct result of the work done by the Babylonians to make the ecliptic an operational tool. Before they produced the modern 12-fold division of the zodiac, the Babylonians used an 18-division scheme of unequal length constellations that included the 12 constellations used today, but with Pisces in 2 pieces, the eastern fish and the western fish, plus another constellation within Pisces called the Swallow that extended into Pegasus, and with the addition of the Pleiades, Auriga, Orion, and Perseus. The Swallow, Perseus, Orion, and Auriga were dropped, probably because they're not ecliptic constellations, but rather holdovers from an earlier time before the ecliptic became well defined. The Pleiades were eventually incorporated into Taurus, and the 2 fishes of Pisces became a single constellation. The sidereal signs are 30-degree segments of the sky. They eventually became associated with the Babylonian calendar. Their associations were slowly incorporated into the greater body of astrological lore. The sidereal signs were made equal length at an unknown date during the first millennium BCE, probably to facilitate computation, and are not the tropical signs used today, although the tropical signs use the same names as their sidereal namesakes. Hipparchus of Rhodes was the foremost Greek astronomer of the first millennium BCE. His exact dates are unknown, but his works span the period 146 to 127 BCE. All of his works but one are lost. Hipparchus constructed a table of chords to facilitate angular measurement, which is in effect the first use of the sine function in trigonometry. But he's best remembered for his discovery of what is now called the precession of the equinoxes. Before Hipparchus, the Greeks were using the sidereal zodiac, which is clearly demonstrated in particular by the work of Timocharis, the foremost Greek astronomer of the 3rd century BCE. Timocharis constructed the first star catalog compiled by a Greek. His dates are also unknown, but his observations span the period 295 to 272 BCE. Hipparchus compared his own 2nd century BCE observations of stars against those of Timocharis, which were approximately 150 years older, and found a difference of 2 degrees in celestial longitude of the same stars, but no change in celestial latitude. The Greeks had not begun to use degree measure as early as 295 BCE. They were probably using cubits. Hipparchus doubtless converted Timocharis' measure into degrees. Specifically, he found that Spica, that is Alpha Virginis, the brightest star in Virgo, was 6 degrees to the west of the autumnal equinox in his own time, but it had been 8 degrees west of the autumnal equinox 150 years earlier. That's a reasonable result, as precession accrues at the rate of approximately 1 degree every 72 years. He was forced to conclude that there was definitely movement between the Earth and the stars, heretofore unknown, which flew directly in the face of the Greek model of the cosmos that put a motionless Earth fixed forever at the center of the universe. The ineluctable conclusion in the Greek world was that the stars had to be moving against a motionless Earth, which led directly to modern tropical zodiac reckoning. That is, the point from which celestial longitude is measured was transferred from the sky to the Earth. This is what defines the difference between tropical and sidereal reckoning to this day. The siderealists stayed with the stars after the seasons no longer corresponded to the sky. The Greeks, and subsequently the West, embraced the solstices and equinoxes into perpetuity after the correspondence between the Earth and the sky had been broken. What is actually happening now is that the Earth moves with respect to an essentially fixed sky, but the Earth's motion was not obvious by any experiment devised in Hipparchus' time. The premise behind Hipparchus' logic is that the initial starting point of the zodiac has to be tied to something that won't change. He was the first Greek to postulate that the vernal equinox was the 0 degree of the zodiac, even though the equinox held 5 and 4 degrees of sidereal Aries in his lifetime. He did that in order to have what he thought was an absolute standard against which to measure bodies. But if it's assumed that the Earth is fixed and the sky is moving, the signs reckoned from the vernal equinox, which moves 1 degree westward against the stars in almost 72 years, quickly get out of synchronization with the signs reckoned from the stars. Sidereal reckoning is not, as a practical matter, subject to precession, because its frame of reference is fixed to a star and an era. The stars do move, but the average proper motion of the entire star field is 1/100th of a second of arc per year. Most of them are so far away that their annual proper motion is 1,000th of a second of arc per year. The stars with large proper motions, which skew the average, are all quite near, like Bernard's star, sometimes called Bernard's freight train, with a proper motion of 10.3 seconds of arc per year. But that star is a 9th magnitude object far beyond the resolving power of the human eye. It's only 6 light years away from the Earth. Sirius, the alpha star in Canis Major, also known as the dog star, is also very close at 8.6 light years away, and likewise, due to its proximity, has moved more than 1/2 degree in the past 2,000 years, although it's not an ecliptic object. Aldebaran, the alpha star in Taurus, has moved slightly more than 1/10 of a degree in the past 1,800 years. But the overwhelming and huge majority of stars are so immensely far away from the Earth that the night sky looks now as it did in remote antiquity, and certainly not different to the human eye, without now and then pictures displayed side by side. It's important to note that many stars appear to move from the vantage point of the Earth, not because of their proper motion, but because of precession, which moves them both tropically and sidereally. This is most obvious near the celestial poles. Since Egypt became a federated state, circa 3000 BC, which is close to the beginning of recorded history, the equinox has moved 70 degrees with respect to the sky, through half the age of Taurus, all of the age of Aries, and almost all of the age of Pisces. Whereas Aldebaran, the fastest moving of the sidereal fiducial stars, has moved less than 1/3 of a degree in 5,000 years. The argument is sometimes pressed that sidereal reckoning is moving too, as if glacial speed and supersonic speed are comparable. But the fastest star in the sidereal pantheon is moving at 4,000ths as fast as tropical reckoning changes with respect to the sky. This is why sidereal reckoning is called fixed as a practical matter, and tropical reckoning is called the moving zodiac. Some modern scholars are confident that Hipparchus changed his mind about the immobility of the Earth at the end of his career, toward the view that the equinox was actually moving against the field of stars. The reasoning is that it's unlikely in the extreme that all the stars examined had the same motion and longitude, which is a requirement if the aggregate of stars were moving against a fixed equinox. Tropical reckoning did not catch on quickly. Wettius Wallens, the foremost Western astrologer of the 1st century of the current era, who lived and worked 200 years after Hipparchus, did not adhere closely to it, either by design or more likely because he wasn't able to determine where sidereal ended and tropical began. Otto Neugebauer and Henry van Hosen wrote in their classic Greek horoscopes that Wallans's work is sidereal. Actually, it appears to incorporate both tropical and sidereal reckoning, which demonstrates that tropical reckoning was both new and poorly established. The greatest astronomer and astrologer of classical antiquity was the polymath Claudius Ptolemy. He lived and worked at Alexandria, Egypt. His dates are also unknown, but probably span the period 100 to 175 CE. His two main works that concern astrology are the Mathematical Syntaxis, a superb astronomical work actually, better known as the Almagest, and the Tetrabiblos, which is a masterwork on astrology. The work of Hipparchus is known mostly via Ptolemy, who was his worthy successor 300 years later. Ptolemy was the unquestioned authority on astrology in the West until the 15th century of the current era, when his work was found wanting by the mathematician Georg Puerbach, better known as Regiomontanus, who noted inaccuracies related to predicted positions of the planets. Ptolemy's astrological work is still relevant and is much studied even today by students of astrology. Tropical and sidereal reckoning were only misaligned by about 1/2 degree at the end of his life, so that, in effect, the zodiac corresponded to what you saw when looking at the sky, which is no longer true. Ptolemy was a full-throated advocate of tropical zodiac astrology and much in advance of his contemporaries in terms of mathematical skill and interpretive skill. The Greek model of the universe was geocentric, with the sun orbiting the Earth. That's not unreasonable because you can't feel the motion of the Earth revolving around the sun, which is 1,000 miles per hour at the equator. Ptolemy also said the Earth could not be rotating, because if that were true, everything not tied down would fly off. The modern model, which with the sun at the center of the solar system, which has been nearly universally understood for several centuries to date, is astronomically correct. In contrast, Ptolemy's work was fully embraced and accepted by the Roman Catholic Church as the uncontested truth until 1822 CE, which is only 200 years ago. Tradition dies hard. Ptolemy took Hipparchus's hypothesis and formalized it via his assertion that the 0 degree of Aries rises with the northern hemisphere vernal equinox forever. That position could not be contested, at least at the time, because you couldn't argue with your eyes, but it was short-lived. Ptolemy, without records sufficiently old, could not know that his lifetime was coincident with the confluence of tropical and sidereal reckoning for the first time in 25,800 years, such that the sky and the ground were in agreement. That is, the northern hemisphere vernal equinox coincided with the 0 degree of Aries exactly, both with respect to tropical and sidereal reckoning, less than 50 years after his death, if he lived to about 175 CE. The model that puts the Earth in motion orbiting the sun was only formally advanced in the 16th century by the Polish genius Nicholas Copernicus in the teeth of intense resistance. That heliocentric hypothesis was not formally proven until the work of the British genius Isaac Newton near the end of the 17th century. The fundamental problem associated with a geocentric model that makes the 0 degree of Aries coincide with the equinox forever is that the sky quickly becomes disassociated from that standard. In everyday terms, that means approximately 7 centuries after the death of Ptolemy, an observer saw 20 degrees of Pisces rise with the sun at the northern hemisphere vernal equinox, as the Arabs did see and noted it toward the end of the 9th century of the current era. Now toward the end of the age of Pisces, fully 25 degrees of precession have accrued since the exact coincidence of tropical and sidereal reckoning early in the 3rd century of the current era. One sees ever so slightly less than 5 degrees of Pisces rise presently with the sun as a fact, not symbolically, at the northern hemisphere vernal equinox. But Ptolemy's insistence that the Earth is fixed in space guaranteed that precession would be understood essentially backwards, which in turn began the tropical sidereal divide 18 centuries ago. The Greeks almost surely did not know, with the exception of Hipparchus of Rhodes, that tropical and sidereal reckoning would diverge. Only someone who could think outside the box and find evidence to support their unorthodox conclusion could suspect, much less know, that tropical and sidereal reckoning would part ways. At the rate of precession, 11,000 years from now, the tropical signs will be literally completely upside down, that is 180 degrees out of sync with their namesake sidereal signs, from which they were originally derived. In other words, circa 13,000 CE, the constellation Libra will rise with the sun at the northern hemisphere vernal equinox. One can see readily, even now, in the present era, that Pisces rises with the equinox, actually, literally, at the northern hemisphere vernal equinox. The modern-day consequence of disregarding sidereal longitude in favor of tropical is that long-term cycles reckoned in tropical longitude do not track the true motion of the sky. For more information on this topic, see the article on my website titled The U.S. Pluto Return, Why Precession Matters. In the 1840s, a British archaeologist, Austin Henry Laird, got permission from the Ottoman government to excavate in their Baghdad province, which contains the site of the ruins of Babylon in modern Iraq. He brought home to England a treasure trove of cuneiform tablets and other artifacts. The most dramatic items he shipped to England were the huge 30-ton winged bulls that reside today in the British Museum in London. The greatest treasure was the thousands of cuneiform tablets with astronomical and astrological content. They were not deciphered until the language of the Babylonians, Akkadian, a Semitic language similar to Arabic, Aramaic, and Hebrew, was cracked in the 1870s. These tablets provided irrefutable evidence that the Babylonians were entirely sidereal in their astrological orientation. These discoveries began to appear in considerable numbers in academic journals in the 1890s, in particular the works of 4 Jesuit scholars, Joseph Epping, Johann Strassmayer, Francis Xavier Kugler, and Joseph Schaumburger. Epping's Astronomisches aus Babylon, Astronomy from Babylon, appeared in 1889. Kugler's Die Babylonische Mondrechnung, Babylonian Lunar Reckoning, appeared in 1900, and his Sternkund und Sterndienst in Babel, which is Star Lore and Star Work in Babylon, appeared as a series from 1907 through 1924, completed in 1935 by Joseph Schaumburger. They were groundbreaking and revealed technical sophistication among the ancient Babylonians that had not been suspected. Cyril Fagin, whose dates are 1896 to 1970, was reading these works. He had taken up tropical astrology in 1916, and by the 1930s was recognized among the serious players in the art. Fagin was one of very few master astrologers of the 20th century. In 1944, he was able to fully grasp that the Babylonians had not only been siderealists, but it was the original form of astrology based on the zodiac, the critical piece of astrology which the Babylonians discovered and developed into its modern form. The revival of sidereal astrology in the West was brought about entirely by his efforts and his books. He encountered strong resistance almost immediately from the astrological world, which in the West was almost exclusively tropical at the time. Fagin's books include Zodiacs Old and New, published in 1950, Symbolism of the Constellations, that came out in 1962, and Astrological Origins, that appeared after his death in 1971. However, many believe that his greatest contribution to the field may have been Solinars, the monthly column he wrote on Western sidereal astrology for American Astrology magazine. This column, which ran for 17 years, did more to introduce sidereal astrology to a new generation of astrologers than any of his 3 books. His battles in magazines 50 years ago, mostly in horoscope and American astrology, especially with Dane Rudhyar, produced a hotbed of interest in astrology that was part and parcel of the wild 1960s. That period was also characteristic of the most widespread interest in astrology since the lifetime of William Lilly 300 years before. I was one of those who were influenced by Fagin's work. I became an avid student of astrology in 1970 and started with tropical. After 2 years as a tropicalist, I was introduced to sidereal astrology by the open-minded attitude of Jim Lewis. Lewis was a lifelong tropicalist, but he respected the siderealists and was never judgmental about his preferred school of thought versus others. After several years studying sidereal astrology, I was persuaded that character analysis was more accurate in a sidereal format, and that sidereal predictive techniques were much more accurate than anything I had encountered as a serious student of the art. Here are a few resources for anyone who would like to learn more about Western sidereal astrology. The book on the left, An Introduction to Western Sidereal Astrology, was my first book. This book includes the basics of Western sidereal astrology, a chapter on mundane aspects, and 3 appendices that touch upon the history of sidereal astrology, the tropical sidereal debate, and explanation of the exaltations. The centerpiece of the book is the delineation of the 45 planet combinations which can be used by both sidereal and tropical astrologers. The middle book is my interpretation course on Western sidereal astrology. In this course, I walk students through the interpretation of 25 horoscopes and show them how to incorporate mundane aspects and stars into their interpretation. This course is for intermediate and advanced students of astrology. The charts use Western sidereal longitude, but the course is also suitable for tropical astrologers, since the same rules of interpretation apply to both schools. I'm currently updating Fagan's first book, Zodiacs Old and New, which has long been out of print. Since Fagan's death in 1970, new information has come to light that supports Fagan's arguments about the antiquity of the sidereal zodiac. This concludes my talk. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to be informed when new books and lectures are available, please go to my website and sign up for our mailing list. On our website, you'll also find articles and additional lectures and webinars on these topics. Thank you for watching.